So my name is Jacqueline Luna. I am the programs manager here at the Coronado Public Library. Live in the Win Room, we have Kelly Andrade, our special collections librarian. We are so excited for this event today. This event is part of our Coronado Community Read. It's a month-long series of events all centered around this year's pick, which is The Women by Kristin Hannah. We were so excited to partner with the Coronado Historical Association for this event. They put together this wonderful event with Taylor Baldwin Kiland and Diane Carlson Evans. Diane is actually the inspiration behind the book. I just think that's so marvelous, and we're so excited to hear your story. As a little background, Diane will be here to discuss a little bit of her book, Healing Wounds, a Vietnam War Combat Nurse's 10-year fight to win women a place of honor in Washington, D.C. She was instrumental in getting the Women's Memorial put into Washington for the Vietnam War. She's going to share her remarkable story, and she's in conversation with Coronado's Taylor Baldwin Kiland, who's here today. She is a writer who specializes in military nonfiction, who has written, co-authored, or ghostwritten over 18 books, including 3 about Vietnam's POWs. She's a former naval officer and a 3rd generation in her family to serve in Vietnam, or sorry, to serve in the Navy. Got Vietnam on the brain. And her work has been featured in CNN, C-SPAN, International Herald Tribune, Associated Press, and so many more. You are here to hear them. I'm going to turn it over to these wonderful women. I'm so thrilled to have you both here. Welcome to the Coronado Library, virtually or in person.
Thank you so very much, Jacqueline, and welcome, Diane. It is so nice to see you again. Jacqueline gave you a nice intro. I think I will also mention that you have been given so many awards and recognitions for your 10-year fight to bring the women's story to the Vietnam Wall. And any of you who have visited the wall in Washington, D.C. has seen that tremendous memorial that Diane championed for more than 10 years. But before that, Diane was a captain in the Army Nurse Corps, a native of Minnesota, and a graduate of the St. Barnabas Hospital School of Nursing in Minneapolis. During her 6 years in the military, Diane served in Vietnam in 1968 and 1969 as a trauma nurse in the surgical and burn wards at Vung Tau, and later as a head nurse in a surgical unit at Pleiku. She now lives in Montana with her husband, and she's the mother of 4 children and 7 grandchildren. And Diane, I'm sure you were thrilled and stunned to see the wild success of the novel, The Women, especially since you were the inspiration behind it. I have read that Kristin Hannah internet stalked you for months, and I'm really curious to know how she found you and met you and got you to contribute to the novel and to the story. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Taylor. I'd love to. But first I want to thank everyone at this library for all the work you've done to give Taylor and I this opportunity to bring to you the story behind the story. There's always a backstory, right? Well, so yes, I get an email and, it says from Kristin Hannah. Well, it can't be Kristin Hannah because I've read her books. I know who she is. She's famous. She's a wonderful historical fiction writer, my personal favorite being The Nightingale. So I get this message from her and she asks, she tells me she's writing a book about women in Vietnam and she had read my book and would I be willing to talk to her? Well, yes. So I got back to her and then a phone call. And Kristin, my book, by the way, Healing Wounds, came out in March of 2020. That was the month we started quarantining for COVID. All my book tour, everything was canceled. I had no publicity, no book tours. My book did not get off to a very good start, as did a lot of books that were published that year and the next couple of years. But Kristin said, well, Diane, I've written a book. She had already written it. Her manuscript was in progress, but she said, I'm writing about the nurses in Vietnam. And I read your book and I was so inspired by it. And I read several other books written by Vietnam nurses, because that's what historical fiction writers do. They read books, they do the research, they do interviews so they can get the historical part in the fiction as accurate as possible. And she said, I have the manuscript ready. would you be willing to read it? I remember saying to her, Kristin, I'd be happy to read your manuscript, but there is a caveat. I said, if I don't like it, I will tell you. She laughed and she said, good, that's exactly what I want to hear. I said, well, you know, us military women, whether we were Air Force, Navy, or Army, for centuries, if you will, certainly the last century, there's a lot of myths and stereotypes about women in the military, and they're not nice. They're not kind at all. And derogatory things have been said about us women. And so I fought for 10 years to tell the truth about these women. And so she said, good, just mark it up. Just let me know, what you're thinking. Well, the manuscript arrived by FedEx. It was double spaced and it was about 12 inches thick.
Wow.
It was such a big book. Of course, it got printed smaller later, but I started reading it at 6 o'clock that night and I didn't finish till midnight. And I want to share this with you because I'm being very open and honest about everything. I had the worst nightmare that night that I've had since Vietnam. And my husband woke me up, shaking me and like waking me up to be aware of where I was. And then he said, you have to stop reading that book. And I had just started it. That's how much it impacted me within just those few short 5 or 6 hours that I started reading it. So I said, well, I'm not going to quit reading it. I'm going to finish this manuscript, but I'll read it in the morning so I don't go to sleep with those images. But that's how it impacted me right from the first chapters. And so, long story short, I swept that manuscript. And there were a lot of red marks, a lot of them. And then we were going back and forth. And as I finished as many pages as I could, I sent them off electronically to her. And yeah, she was so appreciative. And I said, I told you I was going to tell you the truth. Kristin, you got this all wrong. I mean, you've got those operating room. I didn't work in the OR. I was in pre-op and post-op, but I knew enough about it. I said, Kristin, you've got the OR information. You weren't there. To her defense, she was not there. So I said, would you like me to put you in touch with an OR nurse who was at Cu Chi in Vietnam during Tet? She went on to get her PhD. She's brilliant. She would be so helpful to you. And she said, yes, ask her if she would work with me. So she did. The other thing Kristin had all wrong, because she wasn't there, was the helicopters, the geography, and distances between hospitals and Saigon. And it was just all wrong. And I said, Kristin, would you like to talk to a helicopter dust-off pilot who was in Vietnam for two years and flew over 2,000 missions and survived, and he's a colonel? She said, absolutely. So the brilliance of what Kristin does when she writes her historical fiction is she wants to get it right, and she'll talk to the people that can help her do that. And she was so grateful to talking to these people that I connected with her. So of course, now my impression of Kristin, my standards are really high, and she's coming up to the bar now. She's because she really, and she said first, and she was delightful to work with. Kristin is very down to earth, and she really cares about women and getting our stories right. And she said, Diane, I have no ego in this. And I thought, Kristin Hannah has no ego? She's got to have, well, we all have egos. But she was right. She took everything, and I said, and I'm not the last resource on this, Kristin, because I'm speaking from my experience in Vietnam, and there were thousands of other experiences. But this is how I see it from a broad viewpoint. And she said, Diane, I've corrected everything you've told me to. So this is how the manuscript evolved. And we worked, I don't know, several months on it. But just so you know, she had written her story before she ever talked to me. So my book perhaps was an inspiration to her, but I didn't tell her what to put in the book. I didn't create her characters at all. Those are Kristin's characters. I just merely cleaned it up and corrected some the mistakes. And so what she had done, she had read Linda Van de Vanner's book. I served with Linda Van de Vanner in Pleiku. She had read Winnie Smith's book. These were all wonderful books and several others of other nurses' experiences. So she kind of lifted and, she didn't plagiarize. She just read their experiences and gathered them all together to make a composite and create Frankie, Barb, and Ethel. So just very quickly, I called her. I said, okay, this is a deal breaker, Kristin, this is a deal breaker. And she's like, uh-oh, what? I said, you have all three of those women, falling in love with maybe doctors or somebody else. That's not a problem. That's wartime, right? It happens. And they're all, drinking alcohol and going to parties, and some are dabbling in drugs, maybe not all of them. And I said, Kristin, that's 100%. You've just painted the brush of all nurses in Vietnam as doing what Ethel, Barb, and Frankie do. I was definitely not Frankie, okay? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, there were a lot of us, probably the majority, who didn't drink alcohol at all, like me. I was terrified of doing anything with any marijuana or, I'd never been exposed to it at home or in school. And I needed my sleep, and I didn't want to go to parties where that's a danger zone for any military woman we know. Go to parties where there's alcohol. We're setting ourselves up for what? Maybe something not so good. I see Taylor is shaking her head. Yes, she was in the Navy. So I said, one of those women, and just know that I was not judgmental, and I'm still not, about those women. Whatever, it was their choice. I made my choices, they made theirs. Whatever they want, whatever they did in Vietnam was their business, their personal life. And I didn't care what they did, but I cared what I did. So I said, one of the women has to be the one who doesn't dabble in these things. And she said, you're absolutely right. So then one of the characters is the one who, like so many of us, there were 6 women in my hooch, and out of 6 of us, 5 of us made choices that didn't get us into trouble maybe later. Like with Frankie, alcoholism, it's true. The things that, and I think this is coming up in a question you might want to, you had hoped to pose with me, and can I answer it now, Taylor?
Of course.
About, did Kristin embellish? Did she tell the truth about us women, or did she make stuff up? Well, she didn't make anything up. Just, if you could interview all the nurses in Vietnam, they would tell you that they are in that book, and that they did fall in love with doctors, and they did lose loved ones who were killed, and they did develop alcoholism and came home and had to go to rehab. And they did have abortions because there was rape in Vietnam, and there was consensual sex. And I personally know a friend of mine who had a boyfriend, and when she was pregnant, she went home to have the baby, and then she had to get out of the Army because we couldn't stay in the Army then as pregnant women. It wasn't allowed till 72 or 73. It was in the 70s when women, like when I had my baby in 72, I could stay in the military. I wasn't kicked out just because I was pregnant. So I think Kristin really covered so much of our experience in Vietnam, but what she did so well was talk about what we did. And each one of us in Vietnam as nurses had a different job to do. So some of us related more to her, like the OR nurses. The OR nurse I knew at Pleiku, she called me and she said, Diane, she nailed it. She got it perfect. That's the way it was. That was her take on reading the women. And then another nurse calls me and said, well, none of that happened to me. I don't know what she was talking about. But she had a different experience in Vietnam, and she related to some of it, but certainly not all of it. So you can see it's a composite. It's many stories brought together in one big book. And Kristin did it really well. And one of the things that I got upset with, I got so tired of hearing about the mud and the blood. So I called her and I said, Kristin, could you just stop? You've said it enough of the mud and the blood and the horror. And then I stopped and I said, God, I sound like myself when I was in Vietnam. I'd say, God, stop the killing, stop the mud, stop the blood. I said, I think you were right. You're just pounding it. You're pounding that fact into the reader's psyche. So I guess so they get it. And she said, Diane, that's what I do. I really do emphasize in my books. And, you know, you read Four Winds and what the women went through during the Depression and she just grabs you and makes you feel what they're feeling. And even though you weren't there. So I'll leave it at that and let you ask me another question, Taylor.
Why don't we show a couple pictures of you in Vietnam? Jacqueline, I'm hoping that you could pull up some pictures of Diane. And while we do that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your road to military service, Diane. For those of you who haven't read Diane's book, I'm going to show it up here. And of course, we also have it on the screen. Jackie can show it with you. But Healing Wounds, a Vietnam War combat nurse's 10-year fight to win women a place of honor in Washington, D.C. It is about her military service, but it's also about her fight to get women a memorial in Washington, D.C. And she's, like I said, she has been lauded dozens of times with numerous awards, including most recently the Presidential Citizens Medal awarded to her by President Biden in January of this year. So tell us a little bit about your backstory, Diane.
Well, as Jacqueline in her introduction said, I just found it fascinating when I opened up the manuscript, and here's a woman from Coronado Island with a wealthy family, and she wants to go to Vietnam. She's the opposite of me. I grew up on a dairy farm in Minnesota, and with a father who milked cows, and you know, on the homestead that was homesteaded in the 1860s, and my brother still farms it. We're deeply rooted farmers, and my mother, who's a registered nurse, and then I'm reading about Frankie. So I just found this fascinating, how it shows how us women who joined the military, we came from all backgrounds, all walks of life. We came from every state in the Union, and just many different, military, some from military families, some not. Like my two brothers were in the military, one was drafted, and the farm boys around me, our friends, and my 4-H buddy, they were dying. They were being killed in Vietnam because they weren't draft deferments for them. The draft deferments went to the college boys, and a lot of these farm boys weren't going to college because they were going to take over the family farm like my brother. And so I was in nursing school in Minneapolis, and I thought, well, you know, if all these young men around me have to serve in the military and they're going to Vietnam, and I was watching the 6 o'clock news, seeing body bags everywhere and dust off helicopters. And I walked downtown Minneapolis and walked into a Army nurse recruiting office and found one and said, how do I go to Vietnam? I'm going to graduate next year. And she gave me the paperwork and I signed on the dotted line. And after graduation, I'm in Brooke Army Medical Center doing basic training for 6 weeks, and then at Fort Lee, Virginia for 9 months, taking care of wounded soldiers coming back from Vietnam. And then I get my orders. And it's just what I wanted because I had volunteered for Vietnam. That's what I wanted to do. And so I arrived at the 36th Evacuation Hospital, and I worked there for 6 months and worked in the burn unit. And yeah, it was like Kristin talked about, how we were thrust into this chaos of war with no experience to prepare us for war, but then nothing can prepare you for war but war itself. And we learned that. But because of the numbers of mass casualties that we dealt with, 68 and 69, we learned fast. We were young and we were quick, and we had to be brave and we had to be smart and we had to be all these things, but we were all terrified, like, am I going to measure up? Well, it didn't take long to measure up because you quit thinking about yourself. It's just like describing, the 3 nurses when Kristin talked about how they were terrified too to go into the operating room, and what did they know? And you know, fear is a terrible thing. But we got over it. And then we became, what did she call us? Kick-ass nurses. I think she kept using that word. I don't think I was ever called a kick-ass nurse in Vietnam. So it was like, well, that's the current language. But I told Kristin, I said, Kristin, I was never called a kick-ass nurse in Vietnam. And she said, yeah, but you were, Diane. I said, okay, I get it. So, you know, and the doctors would compliment the nurses and say, Frankie, you are a kick-ass nurse. You can do this. And we could, because we had to measure up, and we were there to save lives and bring those young soldiers home to their families or back to their units. And we had to measure up because we were all they had. You know, we were with them 24/7, and our shifts were long, and, you know, our shifts were 12, 13, 14 hours. We didn't quit till the job was done. So we learned in Vietnam that we could deal with almost anything that was thrown our way. And it was, I've said, and I said it in my book, it was the worst year of my life, but it was the best year of my life. It was the best year of my life because I was doing something so worthwhile, despite what people were saying about us back home in the protests. And it was a privilege. It was truly a privilege to be in Vietnam and help save those lives. And I was exposed to mass casualties frequently. I was also exposed to rocket and mortar attacks. And our hospital was attacked, and the hooch right next to our hooch was blown off the face of the map. It was gone, and we knew it because the noise was so deafening that we didn't crawl out from under our beds because that was our bunker under the bed. How safe was that? Well, anyway, I'm glad it wasn't our hooch. 8 nurses were killed in Vietnam. But I think Kristin really drove home the trauma to us medical professionals, the doctors, the medics, everyone, for having to be exposed to so much death and dying and suffering on a daily basis. And and then it affected us later when we went home. But it's interesting because Kristin didn't know one of my colleagues in Vietnam, fellow nurses, but I felt like she had written about him. It was Rye, but this officer was in the Navy as well. But she fell in love with him, and they got engaged. And my hooch mates and I were going to be in her wedding. And she got sent home, and she went to find him, the address he gave her. And when he got to that address, no, we don't know anybody here with that name. It was a bogus address. Well, she knew his friends, and she found one of his friends and said, "Where is so-and-so?" And he said, "Well, here's the address." So she went and found him at that address, and it's just like out of the movies. This woman carrying a baby and a couple other children in the background opens the door, and my friend goes in and asks for so-and-so. And she said, "Well, he's at work." He had betrayed her. He had lied to her. They were engaged, and he was married. That was the ultimate betrayal, through no fault of her own. And the impact that made on her is and was lasting. And just quickly, I'll tell you, Ann Cunningham worked in the operating room at Cu Chi and came to Fort Lee, Virginia, and I was her sponsor, and she was my roommate. She had just come from Vietnam, and I was just going. And she said, "Diane, I'm going to give you some advice. Don't get close to anybody in Vietnam because they just die." Well, her fiance at Cu Chi, 25th Infantry Division, was in a firefight during Tet and came into her hospital, and he'd been killed on the battlefield. So Anne escorted his body home to the family. He was an only son. And she told me that story, and it never left me. And man, I didn't forget it. I did not get close to anybody in Vietnam. I was warned. And so I never had a male close friend. I had lots of friends, and they were men. I mean, we were surrounded by them. And the male nurses and the medics and, the helicopter pilots, but no way. I wasn't not getting close to any of them. Let's see, it's going to sleep. Like, you can still see me. My computer was going to sleep. So for me personally, I had an experience and I had been warned, and I didn't want that to happen to me. But as Kristin talks about in her book, it did happen to a lot of young women. So,
Kristin Hannah's book does include a scene at the dedication of the Vietnam Wall, but the book ends there.
mm-hmm.
It does not cover your decades-long fight to add a statue to the site that pays tribute to the service and sacrifice of women in Vietnam. I was wondering if you could tell us just a little bit, maybe the shorthand version, the summary of that story, and how hard it was to come home from Vietnam.
Yeah, and when I finished Kristin's manuscript and I hadn't finished the part, she surprised me with that I suppose there's no spoiler alerts here because you've all read the book, but when I'd read the manuscript, she didn't have it in my manuscript that I read, that Frankie ends up in Montana buying horses and inviting her friends for basically equine therapy. Come and be with me and my horses. Come. Montana is a very healing place. It's so beautiful and it can be so serene, and that really shocked me because it ended at the wall. The manuscript. And so I was really glad that that's where it ended. That was the perfect ending. She really couldn't get into talking about my story, which was the building of the Viet, and that wasn't her story. Her story was ending with the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I thought that was the perfect ending. And then, of course, my book is different than Kristin's, although similar in many ways, but mine is a memoir. It's an autobiography, and I stuck to the truth. And but the reason I wrote my book, and if you read it in my preface, I said it took me 50 years to write it. I was terrified to write a book. I was terrified to write my own personal story. It's easier to write fiction. Oh, it's just fiction. Nobody has to believe it because it's just fiction. Mine was nonfiction. Would people even believe me? So I didn't write my book because who would believe me? Who would care? And I didn't want to drag it all back up and have more nightmares for the rest of my life. So it took a lot of courage for me to write my book, but a shout out to Bob Welch, my co-author. He was fantastic. He was so helpful to help me frame the book. It's my story, it's my voice. But where did it start, and what was the arc of the story, and where did chapters, I didn't know how to do that. So he kept my feet to the fire, and he said, it's got to be a page turner. Enough on that. Now we go on to the next subject. And he did that very well. But I knew I had to tell the story of the Vietnam Women's Memorial and how hard it was for us women. Here us women come along, and all we want is to have a memorial that portrays us in Vietnam or anywhere around the world standing up to serve our country during a very unpopular war. 265,000 women could have stayed home. I could have stayed home and maybe learned how to golf, which I never did, or play tennis, which I never did. But maybe I could have had a lot more fun if I hadn't decided to be a nurse in Vietnam. But these women were so brave to step up to serve, and I was so proud of them because, well, in Vietnam, I had seen how I was just so proud of the women I served with because I saw how hard they worked and the sacrifices, and we were in peril. We risked our lives. There were women wounded, there were women who died, and the public didn't know anything about us except, oh, maybe there were just nurses in Vietnam. Well, please don't call us just nurses. We're not just nurses. And so in the 80s, when I started this effort, I could not believe the pushback and the mean-spirited things that were said about us women. I mean, they were saying a lot of bad things about our brother soldiers, but my husband was, he couldn't, he said, Diane, this is like motherhood and apple pie. Nobody's going to be against honoring nurses and women. They wouldn't dare say anything bad about us. Well, they did. And so in the beginning, even the press, there were letters to there were editorials written in newspapers. I was called this radical feminist, using the Vietnam dead to further my feminist cause. What did he just say? And then another newspaper said, well, adding a statue of a woman at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial would be like adding Elvis Presley to Mount Rushmore. What's that about? And then he went on, he didn't finish there. This was an editor of a newspaper in Indiana. We had a clipping service. I didn't make this up. He said that, well, maybe to make the women happy, we should paint the Statue of Liberty Dayglow pink, or put a woman in the canoe with George Washington crossing the Delaware. Where did they come up with this to denigrate it and diminish us? Like, it was just, and one of the other worst ones was that it would be like adding a tacky lawn ornament. It would be another trinket on the mall. So we'd be trinkets on them. So, but I persevered. I was not going to quit because I thought those guys were awful. They were just mean-spirited, nasty men, and they were men. And
you had to deal with a lot of mansplaining, didn't you?
Yes, indeed. But long story short, I found allies, and I made a lot of phone calls, and I developed a strategy, and then I didn't quit, and I didn't do this alone. All these awards I get, I say they're not for me. They're for the women who served. They're the ones who deserve it. And for all the volunteers, all the allies, our staff, all the people who helped me along the way to accomplish the mission, which was a portrayal of women on the National Mall. Now, remember, maybe some of you don't know this, there was no memorial on the National Mall honoring military women. This was the first, and now it's still the only. So it's been said that I was the first woman in the history of the United States to dedicate a monument on the National Mall honoring military women. That's a big deal when you think about it. And then for the first and only, people still didn't want us to be recognized. So then I wrote a paper, getting back to Taylor, what we talked about earlier, I wrote a paper and gave it at a college campus about what it took. And it took changing the imagery and the conversations about women in the military. The images were awful. You just name it. You can just conjure up in your imagination the images they would have of women in the military. And the conversations didn't say men and women who served. It was always about the men. And of course, the images were all of the men. So we had to change the conversations and the imagery. And then we had to show them who we were. And that was by getting our stories out. It's all about the stories. And once we did publicity in every state and got volunteers to find women vets to talk to their newspapers and for them to do interviews. And we went on 60 Minutes, and Morley Safer interviewed 5 of us nurses. And so people were now seeing, oh, that's what women did in Vietnam. And if it wasn't for these nurses, the wall, and I testified at over 35 hearings before staff, with staff, and then official hearings with the National Capital Planning Commission, the National Capital Memorial Commission, the Department of Interior, and then Congress, because we had to go to Congress to get a bill passed. And constantly, when I was testifying, I had to show people and demonstrate to these people that this is what we did in Vietnam. And if we weren't there, that wall would be much higher and much wider. We saved 350,000 men were wounded in Vietnam. Not all of them were seriously wounded. They went to aid stations, many of them, and then they went back to their field, or they went to the 26 hospitals that were all over Vietnam when I was there. But many of them ended up in the hospital, and we cared for them. So is not saving the lives and caring for the wounded and the dying of not historic national significance to the United States? So I had to get really good how I was trying to convince these people on deaf ears, like, oh, well, you were just nurses. Nurses just always are. No, we're not just nurses. We're military women. We're soldiers. We're airmen. We are Marines. We, just don't, just place us in the same position as our brother soldiers. We're all here to defend our country. It's in defense of our nation. We're all here to serve however we can, whatever our abilities, whatever our capabilities are. And if we can perform the same as the men, we're just as good as them, and we're just as important and just as needed, right? You wouldn't think I'd have to convince people of that.
Jackie, will you show a picture of the memorials for those who haven't been to the mall and the Vietnam Wall? Let's show a picture of the memorial. There it is. And I think we have one more of Diane in front of the statue. If we still have that.
So sorry, that's the only one I have is this one.
Okay. Well, there's more in Diane's book, which you all are all going to have to get and read. One last question for you. Has the success of this book helped to amplify your story? Not just sales of your book, but just your story and nurses in Vietnam.
That's a good point and a good question, Taylor, because I love listening to people tell me what they think about the women, and they didn't know I had anything to do with it. So they're being totally honest. It's not like, oh, they're trying to make me feel better or not say something derogatory about the book. So I've heard so many comments about the book, and most of them are favorable. A few aren't, but that's any book. There are people who are going to hate the book. There are going to people. It's any book.
The windows around our bed I'm still working on.
Sorry about that. Somebody make sure all your phones are on mute. Go ahead, Diane.
Okay. So now I forgot my train of thought. What was I going to talk about?
I'm talking about, I asked you if the women and the success of the book helped amplify your story and those of nurses in Vietnam.
The majority of the comments that are made to me is that people love the book, and it's a new audience. They're younger people who knew nothing about us. It's a younger audience that is loving this book, and people my age love it because they'll say, Diane, I'm so sorry. I knew nothing about this. I knew nothing about what you went through. I feel so bad that I wasn't there to thank you or comfort you. So there's such a wide range of incredible comments that are made, so that she has a younger and a newer audience, and majority of them love this book. And aside from loving the book, it's selling by them. It's millions of books are being sold. So yes, she has elevated and amplified and put us in the spotlight. She's put us on the map, which if Kristin has done nothing else besides write a great book, she has told the world, and her books are translated in how many languages? And I have a friend in Poland, and she emailed me and she was so excited. She's Polish. And she said, Diane, I was in my bookstore and there was this book called The Women, and it's written in Polish. It's translated in Polish. And she was so excited. And so people in Poland know about nurses in Vietnam and all over the world. So what she has done is she has put the spotlight on us, and she has educated people about the importance and role of women. And that's, of course, what Kristin loves to do. Most of her books are about women that she brings out of the darkness into the light, especially like, the hardest book I read was The Four Winds. And just to feel what the women had to go through during that difficult period of time. So yes, she's done miracles with, and the other thing is, I didn't know she was going to acknowledge me in her acknowledgments. So she praises me, and she said she couldn't have written this book without me. And I said, Kristin, that's a lie. You did very well without me. You wrote that book I just cleaned it up. And then on the next page, she said, now you have to read Diane Evans' book. So now my book was #1 bestseller for months in the Vietnam War biography category, not New York Times, not the LA, no, in the Vietnam War. So my book is selling really well. It bounces between #1 and #18 or something. So people love that they contact me and they say, well, it's a duet. You have to read both books. One is the real deal. I was there. And then there's Kristin's book. And I think my book legitimizes Kristin's book in what I've had to say. And remembering, you know, when I tell people, remember, hers is fiction, but it's based on all she could learn about what it was like for women in Vietnam, and she nailed it.
Well, why don't we turn it over to questions now? I know Jackie and Kelly are moderating the chats and the questions that are coming in either in the Win Room or online. So Jackie and Kelly, what questions does our audience have for Diane?
Hi, Diane, it's Kelly. So I just want to say that a lot of people are saying thank you for your service to both of you as well, and that they're very inspired by you. One of the questions was, were the founders of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial helpful to you?
No, they weren't. And, you know, I told the truth, and I have backed up my truth with letters and so on, but there were some phone calls, and, you know, they weren't recorded. But when I called Jan Scruggs, who's the founder of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and I mean, I have the highest esteem for Jan for what he did for our country, his vision for the memorial, and then the work that he and Jack Wheeler and Bob Dubeck had done to bring it to fruition is magnanimous. And, you know, they had to fight their enemies and their demons as well. But it didn't take them as long. And so when I called Jan to tell him about my idea, it just said, well, that will never happen. And he hung up on me. And Bob Dubeck, he did so much, so I'm not discrediting him in any way whatsoever for what he did for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, because he was a very important part of, as an attorney, and developing the strategy and getting the wall built. And I give him credit for that. But he came to all of our hearings testifying against us, and his testimony was vicious. And one of the things he said was the statue of the three men is enough. It is meant to universally include the women. Well, if we had a statue of women, would the men feel like they were included in it? It was just so, and I thought, you know, and then Jack Wheeler, he was a little on again, off again, and never did really know where he was at with it, but not helpful. So we had three guys who I had hoped who would be helpful and be kind and say, yeah, we need to remember the women. We forgot them, but that did not happen. So I happen to know, because of how I was raised and having a wonderful husband and having three wonderful sons and daughter, that there are a lot of good men out there. I'm going to go find them. General Colin Powell, Admiral Crow, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when I was working on the memorial. And I went to the American Legion and the VFW, and I went to the Disabled American Veterans and Vietnam Veterans of America and Military Order of Purple Hearts and Jewish war veterans. There's all these veterans. I went to every one of them and asked for help. Every single one of them wasn't easy. Every single one of them got behind honoring the women on the National Mall. That's power. That's a lot of power. So now we've got power. We've got help raising money. We're raising the $5 million. Long story short, after 10 years of mean-spirited antagonists and then, you know, making success and then going backwards because one more hearing said no. And finally Congress said yes. So after 10 years, you know, the motto is persistence overcomes resistance. You know, and tenacity. And you know what those people who were against us didn't know? They didn't know how tough us military women are. Ha! And if we could do what we did in Vietnam, we can do this. And not only that, if I failed, I told myself, if I fail doing this, nobody's going to die. In Vietnam, if us nurses really took it personally, we were so young and we just felt it was all on our shoulders. If somebody died on our watch, we blamed ourselves. there was just a lot of guilt, like if we'd had more resources. if
Dave,
we'd
is that
had-
new?
Yes.
So,
Please, please silence your phone. Thank you. Go ahead, Diane.
so, and then, yeah, it was my military nursing experience, and experience in Vietnam that gave me the courage. If I could do what I did in Vietnam, I can do this. And military women come out of the military a different person, because we've had to meet the standards higher than the men. We really have. We have to, the bar is high for us, and we know it. And we step up and we measure up and we do our jobs just as well or better. And so that gave me a lot of courage. And then it was sort of like, I'll show them. The things they're saying about women is disgusting. It's, you know, it was beyond disgusting, some of the things they discredit us women for, thinking that that was going to get people to not support us, where the rest of the country, the families, the Gold Star families, when they came forward and sent so much money and so many letters saying, thank you, I hope you were with my son when he passed, or can you help me find the nurse who was with him so I can thank her? The outpouring of letters, telegrams, because there was no email back in the 80s, and just the outpouring of gratitude that the wounded soldiers had for us. And when they got behind us, then we made progress. So all the good guys came out of the woodwork and put the bad guys in the ditch.
Great story. Other questions from Kelly or Jackie monitoring the chat?
So there was a couple questions about the show China Beach. Were you involved, or and what is your opinion about it?
Well, that's a brilliant question. I'm happy to answer that. When China Beach first came out, I could not watch MASH. MASH reminded me of Vietnam, because it was Vietnam actually. And I had been to Vietnam. I didn't, you know, I watched one program. My dad watched it, and I was home on the farm because we didn't have a TV. My kids did not grow up with a TV, and there's a reason for that. And so I'm home on the farm, and Dad is watching MASH, and Radar is pulling a sheet over a soldier who has just died. And I walked out of the room. I couldn't watch that. Well, now China Beach comes out, and there's Dana Delaney, and now I'm on the farm, and Dad is watching China Beach, and my mom says, Diane, he comes up from milking, just because the program was on when he was milking cows, and he came up from milking the cows to watch China Beach, and then he went and finished milking the cows because he thought he was watching me, because Dana Delaney and I, we had the same hairstyle. We looked like we were sisters. He thought he was watching me. And I watched China Beach with him, and I was horrified. I didn't like it, because the program that I was watching was about the Red Cross women, and they portrayed the Red Cross, what was it, Cherry? They portrayed the Red Cross women like they were a bunch of bimbos. The Red Cross women in Vietnam, every single one of them had to be a college graduate to go to Vietnam. These were educated women, and they had to have skills that they could, you know, the skills to do what their mission was in Vietnam, and they portrayed them as, and then all the alcohol and all the, again, it's just like, this is the stigma, this is the myth, this is the stereotype, like Hot Lips Houlihan coming out of the tent, zipping up her pants, and she's called Hot Lips. I mean, I don't know. These were the stereotypes and the myths that I was trying to work against during those 10 years. I was trying to portray women who we really were. So I wrote a letter to China Beach. And after that, I thought I better watch some more. And then I wrote the letter. And I wrote to John Sacred Young, and I said, you know, you're just taking advantage of what we did in Vietnam. This is just, you know, and I said a lot of words, and he got back to me and he said, Diane, this is a 60s story how did he say it? This is a 60s story, and it won't sell without drugs and sex and parties, something like that. That was all part of. So then he and his co-producer, John Sacred Young, they did something really wise. they decided to invite Vietnam nurses to Los Angeles and interview us. And I was hesitant to go, but my husband said, well, honey, how are they going to tell the true stories if you don't go be interviewed? They need the true stories, because they told us it was 20 somethings who were writing the script for China Beach. Okay. So they invited a photojournalist who was interviewed. They invited a Red Cross woman, a donut dolly, me, and several other nurses. And then we were recorded. I was recorded for 4.5 hours. And then they took our stories and put them on China Beach so they were more realistic. And then they put us on and had us talk to the audience, talk to the viewers a little bit about us. Well, the letters came in to the producers and they said, we only want to see the real nurses. We don't want to see the fake nurses. They wanted to hear from the real nurses. But China Beach got better after that, because they were using our, like Kristin did. She listened to our stories and then put it in her book. It's the same thing. Good question.
That was a good question. Kelly, other questions?
Yeah. So in the book, The Women, it reads that the news coming to the US included a small number dying and that we were winning the war. What was your experience with those whom you wrote back to at home and their understanding of the war?
Oh, these are all such good questions. Oh my gosh. I saved all my letters. Well, no, Mom saved them. I sent letters home. My mom saved every one of them. And it wasn't until after I got back home from visiting the wall that Mom told me to go up in the attic and take my footlocker home. And then she handed me this big packet with a string around it of all the letters I had written home. And I gave those letters to Bob Welch. And then we could see where the truth lied, because, your memories, some disappear because you want them to disappear. But I wrote things back home. And my one letter said, they're just telling all these lies. They're just a bunch of lies. The government is lying about us. It's all about body count, like the winning or the losing of the war. And I had cited one where our body count among our soldiers that we had had in mass casualties was big. It was, and then it came back through the Stars and Stripes or through, I don't know, New York Times, a stringer or something. It was being reported that, our body count was, it was a big lie. It was wrong. And the body count of the dead Viet Cong, or the VC, who were Vietnamese Viet Cong sympathizers, or the ARVNs, was this huge number. Like, so 400 to two of ours and 400 of theirs. So we were winning the war. And I became more aware of that when I was in Pleiku in 1969, and I was getting more news back from home, and we were all talking about this, that the government was lying about so much of what we knew what was happening in Vietnam. And I don't blame the journalists, because the journalists were trying to tell the truth. They were sending home reports that were bona fide, facts, and they were censored and cleaned up. And the report that went back from this journalist was not what he had reported at all, but it had been, censored. So, yeah.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I'm going to make this kind of a two-parter because there's a couple questions about this and a couple questions about this other thing. Do you think that military nurses get more respect now? And then also, how are you feeling about maybe the memorial being removed, or will it be removed because of today, what's going on today?
Okay, first part, absolutely. I think all of our military members have been more respected because of the Vietnam generation welcoming our current generation of military personnel home, being at the airports, greeting them, the Iraq, Afghanistan, in particular, I'll use that as an example, that never again shall we treat our veterans the way the Vietnam veterans were treated. Never again shall we turn our backs on our veterans, separating the war from the warrior. And yes, I think all of our veterans, to include the nurses, are more highly regarded, and they're thanked for their service. Not that that's enough, because they need more than that. They need readjustment. They need benefits from the VA. They need readjustment back into the help with readjusting back into the community. They need help with preventing suicide and all of the above that is necessary to bring a soldier truly home. And healing and heal. You know, we're healing is a lifetime process. We're always healing. And yes, I have to tell you, our statue on the National Mall is the standing woman is a woman of color, because when we had our design competition to find the perfect memorial for us, and Glenna Goodacre, our wonderful sculptor, when she read the criteria, she got it. And we said, this is not just for nurses. This is for all the women who have served around the world during the Vietnam era. They were all important. Every job was necessary. Every job was important. They all deserve recognition. There were women of color. And, you know, there were, well, we are the microcosm of America in that memorial. And the wounded soldier is part Hispanic and part Native American, the model, because she used models. And so we have women, we have people of color, and yes, what are they going to do? Remove our statue because we've honored these patriotic people who stepped up in defense of our nation to save lives, and they lost their lives? Are we going to erase the names on the wall of all the people who are transgender and lesbian and gays? I knew lesbian and gay people in the military, and they had to be very silent about their identity or they were discharged. And that has changed, thankfully. We have moved forward to where we need to be. And now these people and we women are being targeted, and to remove the websites of notable people from the Arlington Cemetery, General Colin Powell for one of them, and all the way back to when the cemetery was started. It's just unconscionable. I'm afraid the evidence is out there right now that we should all be terrified of what's happening. Are we to be all just white people, white supremacists who deserve credit? I don't think so. That's not America.
Do we have time for one more question?
Give
Yeah,
me
go
one,
for it.
yeah, give me one more second. Here we go. I was wondering if the success of getting the Vietnam Women's Memorial helped pave the way for the Military Women's Memorial, formerly Women in Service to America.
I have the answer to that, and it's yes. When I was going to the American Legion and the VFW, World War II women would come up to me, and they were anxious, and some were angry, and said, well, you Vietnam veteran women, you forgot about us. What about us? Why don't you include us in your memorial? And my answer to them was, I would just graciously say to them, you deserve a memorial, and you should have had a memorial years ago. But the memorial to the Vietnam veteran women is going to be on the grounds of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's not appropriate to have World War II, Korea, all the World War I on the grounds of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And nobody is doing this for us. Us Vietnam vets are doing this for us. So if you want a memorial, you have to do what we're doing and get organized and get legislation passed, and you deserve a memorial. You need to do this. So long story short, it started happening, and these women got together, and then General Vought, God bless her, she was tenacious too, and she didn't give up, and they easily got their legislation, and then they found the perfect site. And I'm worried about that because it's the Military Women's Memorial is in Arlington Cemetery. It's on DOD property, but they're a nonprofit. They are not federally funded, and neither were we. The government did not give us one penny because it's against the law. There's a law that says governments will not build memorials, war memorials. I don't know, maybe they broke those rules, but they didn't spend a penny. We had no federal funding. We raised all of our money, as did the Military Women's Memorial. They are a nonprofit. They continue to raise money to pay the bills, to build the memorial, and it's beautiful, and to continue its programs. And so is that going to get wiped out because it's for women and we're part of DEI, we're part of inclusivity? It's just so unnerving to think that these things are happening. But yes, it followed ours, and it's a beautiful memorial, and it's very different than ours, as you know. Ours is a sculpture. Theirs is a building that has archival materials. It has a theater. It has a place for military women to come and be together and have programs. And it's also a beautiful memorial in and of itself, but it's educational. It's just, and it costs a lot of money to do the upkeep. So they're constantly fundraising. So yeah, I think we should all be worried.
Well, Diane, this has been a fascinating hour-long conversation with you, and I really appreciate you're doing this. And I just wanted to remind everyone, maybe we could show a picture of the cover of Diane's book again, Jackie. It's called Healing Wounds, a Vietnam War combat nurse's 10-year fight to win women a place of honor in Washington, D.C. And it is, of course, about her Vietnam journey as well as her homecoming journey and her fight to get a memorial on the mall. And for those of you who want to learn more about Diane, she has a website. It's DianeCarlsonEvans.com. So you see the way she spells her name right there, DianeCarlsonEvans, DianeCarlsonEvans.com. There's a lot more about her and her story on that website. And I'll just let you have the last word, Diane.
Well, I want to thank you all for this opportunity. I'm always so happy to talk about my sister veterans and how deserving they are, and what it took to honor and remember them, and my gratitude to Kristin Hanna for enlightening the world about our service through her book. And I can hardly wait to come back to Coronado Island. Thank you. This has been a great honor, and thank you, Taylor, so much. And Taylor's books are amazing. I've read Unwavering, which was about the wives and what they did to help bring their POWs home. So if you haven't read Unwavering, that is a book that is a must read, because you will be so proud of these women for their tenacity, because there was pushback against them. The government didn't, the administration didn't like that these women were making a lot of noise about treating our POWs humanely and trying to bring them home. So that's another really important book. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for coming today.
All right, thank you, everyone. This has been recorded. We will get this online in the next couple of days. Thank you both so very much. This was just phenomenal. Thank you for sharing your story, Diane. Thank you, Taylor, for such a wonderful discussion. Truly, we're so fortunate to have you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Have a great
Bye,
day.
everyone.
Bye-bye.